need salt and pepper, but I like to get a little bit more fancy than that.
Members, her anger hardened into resolve, and the final straw came after one of her most terrifying health scares, when she was placed on life support, and while her family feared she would not survive, TLC cameras rolled, capturing every agonizing moment for the season, and Tammy later told confidants that she believed the producers were more concerned with whether they had enough footage than with her safety, and it was in the aftermath of this trauma that she began quietly plotting her exit. Though the contract still loomed over her, but she was tired of being disposable, tired of being humiliated, tired of seeing herself turned into a monster for profit while she received only crumbs, and so, armed with documentation and fury, she prepared for a confrontation that would shake her relationship with TLC to the core, and when the moment came it was not in front of cameras but in a Nashville conference room, a sterile setting with a long wooden table separating her from the executives, who had once promised her a better future, and though they expected another one of her outbursts, something they could dismiss as Tammy being Tammy, what they encountered instead was a calculated offensive, as she threw a folder thick with notes, contracts, and mismatched pay stubs onto the table, her voice cutting sharp as she demanded answers, and as executives shifted uncomfortably, tugging at ties and clearing throats, it became clear that this was not the fiery but impulsive woman they thought they could control but someone ready to wage war, and in that moment, she transformed from a pawn of reality TV into a challenger of the very system that had exploited her, and friends later described it as watching David hurl a stone at Goliath, except this time David had gathered months' worth of ammunition, proof of episodes filmed but uncounted toward pay, mysterious deductions no one could explain, and disparities between promised salaries and delivered checks, and though executives tried to deflect, to minimize, to suggest misunderstandings, Tammy did not back down, reminding them that they had built an empire off her life, her pain, her family, and that she would no longer allow herself to be treated as disposable, and while the outcome of that battle would continue to ripple in the months that followed, what mattered in that room was that Tammy finally claimed power, finally refused to be silenced, and in doing so lit the spark of a scandal that exposed not just her own mistreatment but the darker mechanics of reality television itself, a world where vulnerable people's lives are commodified, their dignity sacrificed for profit, and where networks hide behind contracts while stars are left to endure not only financial exploitation but the psychological toll of being consumed as entertainment. And as Tammy walked away from that conference room, from TLC, and from the show that had once promised hope, she knew the road ahead would be difficult, her health still fragile, her reputation still tangled in the narrative TLC had built around her, but she also knew she was free, and for the first time in years, she was no longer just a character in someone else's story but the author of her own, determined to show the world the Tammy Slaton beyond the edits, beyond the drama, beyond the spectacle, a woman who had survived judgment, poverty, addiction, betrayal, and exploitation, and who was finally ready to demand the respect she had always deserved. Tammy Slaton never asked for the kind of spotlight that would one day consume her entire world, a spotlight that turned her private battles into public entertainment and eventually led to the eruption of a salary scandal so shocking that it forced her to cut all ties with TLC and the reality show that had once promised her hope, understanding, and a chance to share her truth on her own terms, yet instead delivered betrayal, exploitation, and the crushing realization that she was worth more to the network as a spectacle than as a human being, and in order to understand how things reached this point one has to start much earlier, back in Dixon, Kentucky, where Tammy was born and where her life was shaped by poverty, health complications, family struggles, and the quiet but heavy weight of judgment that seemed to follow her everywhere, because long before the cameras arrived she had already endured years of ridicule, hospital visits, and battles with food addiction that left her isolated and unsure whether she would ever be seen for who she really was, and when TLC first approached her with the idea of 1,000-pound sisters, she was torn between skepticism and hope, cynical about the way reality TV could twist lives yet also desperate for a platform that might finally let her reclaim her narrative, and she listened as producers painted rosy pictures of a show about love, family, and overcoming obstacles, a documentary-style journey that could inspire viewers struggling with weight, food, and self-image, and for Tammy, this sounded like redemption, like maybe the people who had judged her all her life could finally understand what it felt like to walk in her shoes, but she was not prepared for the way TLC cameras would cut, splice, and shape reality, How they would transform her existence into a drama wrapped up in cliffhanger and shocking twists, because networks do not simply record life, they package it into consumable products, and very quickly Tammy realized. She was no longer simply Tammy but a character, the spark plug of the show, the sister people could not look away from, and while Amy was often framed as the light-hearted, funny, sometimes clumsy balance, Tammy was portrayed as volatile, stubborn, and dramatic, which made for fantastic ratings but chipped away at her dignity, and though viewers were captivated, some mocking her while others defended her, what mattered most to TLC executives was that everyone was talking, everyone was watching. And the numbers were climbing, and yet while Tammy's face dominated advertisements and her meltdowns fueled memes and viral clips across social media platforms, behind the scenes she was earning pennies compared to the millions TLC raked in through ads, streaming, and international distribution, with early reports suggesting she and Amy earned as little as $1,000 to $1,500 per episode, an insulting figure when contrasted with how much revenue the network generated from their pain, and for Tammy. This was not just about money but about respect, about whether the life she laid bare on screen, exposing her most vulnerable moments, her health scares, her tears and tantrums, was worth more than crumbs, as she reportedly told friends, and for a while she convinced herself to endure, telling herself that persistence would eventually lead to a raise, to more honest storytelling, to recognition. But instead the opposite happened, because as seasons progressed, her health deteriorated further. Hospitalizations became part of the plot, her very survival became a ratings hook, and each emergency that terrified her family was transformed into a shocking cliffhanger for audiences at home, and when she asked for breaks to focus on her recovery, executives resisted, reminding her that momentum could not be lost, that viewers wanted the real Tammy, though the Tammy they wanted was a version edited for maximum drama, not the woman who laughed with her nephews or tried quietly to improve. Because those moments rarely made it past the cutting room floor, replaced instead with screaming matches, tears, refusals, and scenes that painted her as perpetually angry, stubborn, or hopeless, and this editing created a cycle where viewers' harshest judgments were reinforced, and the flood of online bullying became overwhelming, with strangers ridiculing her weight, intelligence, relationships, and worth as a human being, while TLC executives seemed satisfied so long as ratings remained high, and trapped under a multi-season contract that made leaving nearly impossible without financial penalties or lawsuits, Tammy felt like a prisoner of her own life, her suffering broadcast for the world with little compensation in return, her resentment growing as she realized that no matter how much she gave, the network only wanted more chaos, more conflict, more Tammy the spectacle and less Tammy the person, and by the time season 3 rolled around, she was no longer just a reality star but a cultural flashpoint, a name that sparked debates across Twitter, YouTube, and TikTok, with some calling her toxic and others calling her exploited, but either way she was being talked about constantly, her life dissected frame by frame, her behavior endlessly analyzed, and TLC leaned into the controversy, deliberately encouraging situations that would heighten drama, because messy reality meant more viewers and more ad dollars, and yet Tammy's bank account did not reflect any of that. With whispers beginning to circulate that not only were her paychecks small but they were being manipulated, reduced, or withheld, and when she compared her contracts to the actual deposits, she began to suspect she was being shortchanged, and though she initially dismissed these concerns, once she started collecting evidence, bank records, discrepancies, text messages from producers, even rumors whispered by sympathetic crew. Amy Slaton's story was supposed to be the kind of uplifting reality television arc that networks like TLC thrived on, a narrative that began in hardship and ended in triumph, a woman who would defy the odds, overcome obesity, achieve her dreams of motherhood, and inspire viewers all around the world with her humor, resilience, and relatability. When she and her sister Tammy were introduced to audiences on 1,000-Pound Sisters, no one could have predicted just how quickly the two Kentucky siblings would become household names, sparking endless conversations, memes, and debates about their health, their choices, and their messy yet undeniably human family dynamics. At first Amy seemed to embody everything the audience wanted from such a show. She was funny in a self-deprecating way, she was willing to show vulnerability, and she was deeply relatable as a woman who struggled but also carried an unmistakable desire to do better for herself. Her early storyline focused on her dream of having children, her marriage to Michael Holterman, and her desperate attempts to prove to herself and the world that she could not only lose weight but also create the stable family she never had growing up. When she underwent gastric bypass surgery and began to shed pounds, fans erupted in cheers across social media. When she revealed she was pregnant, viewers treated it as if it were their personal victory too, because for so long Amy had been cast as the one with the potential to succeed, the sister who might actually rise from the ashes of poverty and obesity and create a better future. On screen, Amy was thriving, and for a moment, it really did seem like the fairy tale was going to come true. But as so many reality stars before her have discovered, what the cameras capture is rarely the full story, and what looks like triumph on screen often conceals darker struggles off camera. While Tammy was painted as the stubborn, angry, and resistant sister, the one viewers criticized for refusing to change, for yelling at her family, for lashing out at doctors, Amy was quietly slipping into her own patterns of destruction. Insiders whispered about fights with Michael that turned increasingly bitter, about stress-induced meltdowns, and about choices that hinted at a woman unraveling under the weight of fame, pressure, and personal demons. Fans who once adored her began to notice a change. The goofy, bright, self-deprecating woman who made them laugh now appeared tired, irritable, and erratic. Her once sparkling eyes seemed dulled, her laughter forced, her patience frayed, and her appearance often reflected stress rather than joy. Online forums became hubs of speculation. Some fans insisted Amy was simply overwhelmed with motherhood and the pressures of being on television, while others argued that something more sinister was going on. Her marriage to Michael, once portrayed as stable and supportive, now seemed riddled with cracks. The custody battles that would come later were foreshadowed by subtle tension on screen. Arguments about chores, money, and Amy's priorities leaked through even when TLC's editing tried to emphasize lighter, comedic tones. Viewers who had rooted for her began to whisper among themselves in comment sections and fan groups that Amy was changing, and not in the way they had hoped. The turning point came when rumors of drug use began circulating online, tied not only to Amy herself but also to her new relationship with Brian LaVaughn after her marriage to Michael collapsed. The ripple effects have been seismic. Fans, long accustomed to seeing the sisters as both allies and antagonists, have erupted into furious debate across social media platforms. On Twitter, Reddit, Facebook groups, and TikTok, arguments rage over who is in the right. Some have rushed to Amy's defense, framing her as a protector, the responsible sibling trying to shield her vulnerable sister from her own self-destructive tendencies. These defenders argue that Tammy, with her history of impulsive decisions, health crises, and fiery temper, may not have been capable of responsibly managing a property of such value. Others, however, see no gray area. For them, Amy's actions amount to nothing less than betrayal, a cold calculation to strip Tammy of her security and autonomy. These critics argue that the very foundation of sisterhood has been undermined, that Amy crossed a line no sibling should ever dare approach. Within the family itself, insiders describe the fallout as nothing short of catastrophic. What had once been tense but manageable disagreements over money, fame, and personal choices has now escalated into open hostility, with Tammy reportedly refusing to speak to Amy outside of legal channels. Friends close to Tammy say she feels humiliated, as though the sister who was supposed to have her back has stabbed her squarely in it. Amy, meanwhile, is said to be reeling from the backlash, torn between doubling down on her belief that she did the right thing and crumbling under the weight of accusations that she is a thief in her own family. The silence between them has grown deafening, punctuated only by the cold, formal language of lawyers and legal filings. As the case inches forward, the legal and emotional stakes continue to mount. Should the court rule in Tammy's favor, Amy could be forced not only to return the property but also to pay significant financial damages, a blow that could upend her own family's stability. If Amy somehow prevails, however, Tammy's sense of betrayal may calcify into permanent estrangement, a scar on their relationship that no amount of apologies could heal. The prospect of the sisters reconciling seems increasingly remote as each day passes, and fans who once tuned in to watch their bickering with affectionate amusement are now witnessing what looks like an irreversible breakdown of trust. The property dispute has also raised uncomfortable questions about the role of reality television in fueling, exposing, and perhaps even exacerbating such family fractures. For years, TLC has packaged the Slaton sisters' lives into consumable drama, editing hours of footage into tidy arcs of conflict and resolution. But as this lawsuit makes clear, some conflicts do not resolve. Some wounds are not healed by the rolling of credits or the promise of another season. Instead, they fester, unseen by cameras, until they explode in ways no producer can control. For fans, the realization is jarring. The storylines they laughed at, cried over, and debated were only fragments of a far more complicated reality, one in which love and betrayal are not just entertainment but lived experience with devastating consequences. Tammy's lawsuit, her public sense of betrayal, and Amy's silence all combine to create a narrative far darker than anything aired on 1,000-Pound Sisters. This is not about diet plans, surgeries, or sibling spats. This is about property, power, trust, and survival. And as the case unfolds, the outcome promises to redefine not only the sisters' relationship but also the way fans perceive the family they thought they knew. Will Amy be exposed as a schemer who prioritized control and financial gain over loyalty, or will Tammy be portrayed as a victim of her own instability, with Amy cast as the reluctant caretaker who made a difficult but necessary choice? The truth, as always, may lie somewhere in between, but the damage inflicted by the perception of betrayal may prove irreversible. As whispers of depositions, court dates, and possible settlements swirl, the Slaton family faces an uncertain future. Their once shared narrative, carefully constructed for television, has fractured into competing versions of reality, each sister clinging to her truth with a ferocity born of both love and rage. For Amy, the burden of proof may hinge not just on paperwork but on convincing the world that her intentions were noble. For Tammy, the fight is not only for property but for validation, a declaration that she is not disposable, not a side character in her own life, not someone to be managed or erased by those closest to her. And so the battle rages on, not in the living rooms of America but in the cold corridors of the legal system, where sentiment means little and betrayal cuts deep. The fans watch, speculate, argue, and judge, but in the end, only Amy and Tammy truly know the weight of what has been lost. What began as a story of two sisters chasing health and happiness has spiraled into a cautionary tale of fame, family, and the corrosive power of mistrust. Whether reconciliation is possible remains to be seen, but one thing is certain: the scars of this property dispute will linger long after the final gavel falls, long after the cameras stop rolling, long after the hashtags fade. It is the kind of betrayal that redefines not just a relationship, but an entire family legacy.